Greetings everyone, this is the session on vaping and tobacco harm reduction, 6 things you need to know. My name is Clive Bates. I am former Director of Action on Smoking and Health, and I've been an advocate, I make no apology for that, for tobacco harm reduction since 1997, but I have no competing interests with respect to the main industries involved in this field. The 6 things that we need to know. I'm going to crack straight on with these. The first is just to dwell for a minute on smoking itself. This remains a huge problem in society. I think you all probably know there's just a range of harmful effects on the body arising from the inhalation of smoke for cancer, cardiovascular disease, lung, and a variety of other impacts. Smoking kills around 96,000 annually in the UK, and it's a bigger source of death than obesity, alcohol, road accidents, drug misuse, and HIV combined. The deaths are quite specific, however. They're not the same as some of those others. And we know from the EPIC doctors study that the typical median lifelong smoker is losing around 10 years of life between the age of 73 and 83. So that's the kind of pattern of mortality. The good news from that study, though, is that people who stop smoking before middle age, and I'm talking here in the sort of 30s to early 40s, those curves hardly separate at all, and you avoid most of the premature mortality associated with smoking if you quit by the early 40s. So there's a lot of hope there, and that obviously bears into these new ways of quitting smoking. It's really important to see smoking as strongly correlated with deprivation of varying forms. So there's a strong employment status gradient, a socioeconomic status gradient, an education status gradient, a mental health status gradient, and then when you go to some specific subpopulations, people with particular forms of mental illness or substance use, you see incredibly high levels of smoking prevalence. Also people in particular settings, homeless and prisons, you see again very, very high levels of smoking. If you put all of that together and you look for what the main predictors for smoking are, you see that living in the most deprived areas is a very strong predictor for smoking, over 4 times the sort of base rate for people living in the most deprived areas. And the smoking prevalence map looks very similar to the deprivation map for exactly that reason. And the places that you see the highest rates of smoking prevalence are in those kind of classically poor areas. And these are the NHS commissioning group areas that have the highest rates of smoking prevalence, often twice as high as the English average. I also just want to point out that tobacco policy can impose harms on people. This is the breakdown of the price of so-called budget cigarettes, which are now over £10 per pack of 20. This is the sort of recent price from Tesco. 80% of that is tax. If you were a pack-a-day smoker, you'd be spending £3,800 a year if you were purchasing those cigarettes legally. If you compare that to universal credit, for a single person aged over 25, £4,918 a year. That's about 78% of what you'd get from universal credit. A massive economic burden from the policy that we use to try and suppress smoking. That's an even bigger imperative to try and do something about it. Okay, so on to the better news now. We have a range of technologies that may be able to obsolete cigarettes. Let's start with the most important insight in this area. People smoke for the nicotine but die from the tar. The nicotine is the drug and the reason why people smoke. The drug itself, not particularly harmful. It's the thing that's doing the damage are the products of combustion. The tar, the hot, sticky particles of burning or burnt organic tobacco leaf and the hot gases that are products of combustion. That's what's doing the bulk of the harm. And that has been known for some time and is still the case today, of course. But based on that insight, we have the basic proposition for tobacco harm reduction. We now have a range of products that can deliver nicotine without combustion. So the vaping products, heated tobacco products, oral nicotine products. So these are products that you consume through the mouth. They don't have tobacco in, but they do have nicotine. And then traditional or long-standing smokeless tobacco products. All of these deliver nicotine without combustion and therefore without products of combustion. American commentators have said that this represents a diverse class of alternative nicotine delivery systems, and it has the potential to disrupt the 120-year dominance of the cigarette and render cigarettes obsolete. And I agree with that. That is a prospect. Okay, so let's look at one example of this where we have proof of concept. And this is the experience of snus in Scandinavia. Snus are like little tea bags full of tobacco that you place between the lip and the gum, and the nicotine is absorbed through the oral mucosa. Sweden is a remarkable standout. It has by far the lowest rates of smoking, around sort of 6–7% now in Sweden, compared to around 25% as the European Union average. As a result of that, Sweden also has much lower rates of smoking-related disease, and if you know that, those are that chart on the right points to smoking-related mortality. Because you can see that Sweden is also an outlier for that in the European Union. Turning now to vaping and the effect that this is having on the British market for consumer nicotine. We currently have around 3 million vapers. Around 1.6 million of those are exclusive vapors, around 1.3 million also smoking. We have around 8 million smokers. Okay, so this is making a large difference, a large intrusion into the tobacco and nicotine market in the UK. The government has set a target for 2030 of achieving a 5% smoking prevalence. And that would more or less be a 2/3 cut compared to where we are today. And if you compare that to the progress that was made in the previous decade, here we can see that smoking prevalence came down by about 1/3 between 2010 and 2020. And we now want it to go down by about 2/3 between 2020 and 2030. On to the third area. None of this would be of much value to us if the new products weren't much lower risk. If we were just replacing one harm with another, there'd be no value to that. This is the assessment of the Royal College of Physicians in 2016, and they say that e-cigarettes are unlikely to exceed 5% of the risk of those associated with smoked tobacco products, and may well be substantially lower for this figure. Now, that's not a figure that's just plucked out of thin air. The reason for it is that we can understand the levels of toxicants that we find in the bodies of smokers. So this is biomarker evidence. It's one particular study, and the bars on the right-hand side represent the exposures of vape found in vapors compared to smokers, and the bar next to them is NRT users. And you can see that the levels of exposures of these key toxicants is much lower and low and comparable to the exposure in people using pharmaceutical nicotine, NRT. Now, that's just one study, but Public Health England did a survey of all the biomarker studies, which it included in its annual evidence review in 2018. And that review also concluded that on the basis of those studies, we should expect e-cigarettes to be much less risky. And this is the comparison that they came up with, based on current knowledge, stating that vaping is at least 95% less harmful than smoking, remains a good way to communicate the large difference in relative risk. Turning now to heated tobacco products, this is a schematic of the Philip Morris IQOS product. These are products that heat tobacco, pass a kind of aerosolized vapor through them, picks up the nicotine and the tobacco flavors, and smokers just inhale that. Still a kind of vaping product. This is the biomarker data from that, the biomarker data that Philip Morris presented to the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. The yellow bars represent IQOS and the green bars represent the decreases in biomarker exposure in people who quit smoking completely, smoking abstinence. And you can see that they are more or less the same. The reductions in biomarkers of exposure in switching to IQOS and switching stopping completely were more or less the same. And on the basis of that evidence, the Food and Drug Administration awarded the company a modified risk order, saying that there was a measurable and substantial reduction in morbidity and mortality was likely, and that overall releasing this product into the US market was likely to benefit the health of the population as a whole. And that was after 2 million pages of data were submitted to the FDA. However, although the expert perception is that these products, vaping, heated, smokeless products, are much less risky, that is not reflected in public perceptions, unfortunately. And this is data from the ASH YouGov survey showing a particular worsening in 2020. I'll come back to why that is in a minute. But 34%, the orange bar there, thought that vaping was more or equally harmful to smoking. That is a perception that could not be more wrong. There's no basis for that in evidence, and no legitimate scientific opinion really holds that view. Nevertheless, it is widely held in the public. Also, the public is becoming less confident that vaping is much less harmful than smoking, which is actually the right answer. Why might this be? Well, first of all, there's the obvious thing that there's a terrible news flow associated with these products. And here's a classic example from The Sun: vaping as bad as fags. Now, the origins of this story are quite interesting. It comes from a particular study on aortic stiffness, which is an acute effect associated with nicotine use. It is a terrible way of comparing the risks of vaping and smoking. It has no basis. It's not a realistic way of, when you look at all the things that are associated with smoking, cancer, cardiovascular disease, COPD, and so on. It's not a reasonable basis for comparison. It's even worse than that, because the same author back in 2003 did a study showing that caffeine has similar effects on aortic stiffness, and there's no really convincing epidemiology that caffeine is a driver of cardiovascular disease. So what we've got here is a classic. There's an observed effect that has been taken as a proxy for risk, and in fact in The Sun as a proxy for complete comparison of all the risks associated with smoking and vaping. Yet the headline is the main message that's come out of this. Now, the reason why things have worsened, particularly in 2020, I think are attributable to an outbreak of serious lung injuries that occurred in the United States and gained press coverage worldwide. And this is something that's known as EVALI, e-cigarette and vaping product associated lung injury. Over 3,000 people were hospitalized and over 60 young people, mainly young people, died from it. Clearly a very serious episode. However, it turns out that it's not at all attributable to nicotine-related vaping. It comes from vaping mainly illicit cannabis, THC vapes, that were adulterated with a cutting agent, vitamin E acetate, which is used to make the cannabis oil go further, make more money from it. And it was that was doing the harm to the lungs of people vaping these THC liquids. Many of them didn't say that they were using cannabis for obvious reasons. Illegal, caused them problems with their employers, their schools, their families, their work, their colleges, and so on. So there's a lot of confusion about what the underlying cause was. Nevertheless, we are pretty clear now that it was something to do with THC vaping and this contaminant. That's what the pattern of hospitalization shows, entirely consistent with a localized supply chain contamination. Localized to the United States, didn't really appear anywhere else. Rose sharply in late 2019. Once people started to understand what the problem was, the vitamin E acetate was taken out. Even criminals don't necessarily want to kill their customers, and the supply chain began to empty of these contaminated vape pens, and the rate of hospitalizations and death declined sharply and more or less disappeared by early 2020. Okay, on to the fourth area. I want to talk about how this actually works, okay? And it's slightly different to a normal smoking cessation intervention. First of all, let's think of it as a smoking cessation intervention. There's good evidence. We know from randomized controlled trials that these products are safe and effective when it comes to quitting smoking. We know from observational studies, if we follow people, they use these products, they end up quitting smoking. And we know from population trends that where vaping has risen, we've seen a decline that's faster than we would expect normally in smoking. So there's good evidence. It's backed up by extensive user testimony of people describing their experience. And also, frankly, it's what you'd expect. And a new product comes out, it's much safer, and it has many of the same attributes to the users that smoking does, and it's got a few other things as well. So it's more or less what you'd expect. There's good trial data. As I said, this is one example led by the UK researcher Peter Hayek. 886 smokers. 1 year quit status was the primary outcome measure, and they found that 18% had quit with e-cigarettes, 9.9% with NRT, so roughly twice the efficacy. The Cochrane Review has started to endorse this as an approach. More people stop smoking. The evidence isn't that strong. The evidence base isn't that strong. More people stop smoking. And we think, or the Cochrane Review thinks, that nicotine-based e-cigarettes are helpful in stopping people smoking. So we're starting to see convincing traditional evidence, but I don't think that tells the full story. The real question is, what is it that causes people to choose to vape instead of to smoke? And most of them who do this are going nowhere near any healthcare provider or any sort of clinical setting. It's something that's actually happening in the marketplace. And the way I like to think of this, the sort of public health impact, is through a sort of fairly crude equation. The harm reduction that we get is a function not just of the reduced risk, but also the number who switch. And the number who switch is the proportion who succeed, but also a function of who actually tries it. And that gets down to who finds it appealing, who actually wants to do this. Okay, and if you have a lot of people who want to try it and it's effective and it's much lower risk, then you're starting to get a large public health effect from the result, from having that product in the marketplace. And I think the way to think of it is that vaping offers a value proposition, a rival value proposition to smoking. You have to take everything into account: the price, what people think of it, where you can use it, how the product works. Is it as satisfying as smoking? What the positioning is like in, is it easy? How do you think about it? Who's recommending it? Is the packaging and branding attractive, and so on? So The role of tobacco control in some ways is to take that value proposition for smoking and to degrade it. In the case of tobacco harm reduction or vaping, you might want to enhance it or enhance it relative to smoking on the basis that that will cause people to move from one to the other. And there's a lot of lessons in that model for how you think about policy. The trouble comes if you try and degrade the vaping proposition, you make that transition less attractive and you may end up with more smoking as a result. And that feeds into how you think about policy making in this area, and that's something we'll come back to in the final section of this presentation. Okay, so now I want to talk about one of the controversial areas and look at the youth vaping epidemic, okay, so-called youth vaping epidemic. First of all, the position in the UK and Britain. Okay, now we've seen a gradual increase over time. This is the data from the Ash YouGov surveys as before, increasing from 2013 to 2020. However, you can see that the levels of regular youth vaping, the black and the striped bars on these charts, is still relatively low. It's not a massive uptake among young people in this survey. But I think there's an even more important finding than that we'll see on the next slide. And this is that among those who are vaping, a vast majority are smokers or former smokers. They're people who are already engaged in nicotine use in some way. The interesting thing here is that if vaping is diverting them from smoking and creating an alternative to them, it may be diverting them from a lifelong or long-term smoking habit, in which case it's a good thing from a public health point of view, even if we're uncomfortable about the idea of young people vaping. So we have to approach this question of youth vaping from the perspective that young people do themselves engage in youth risk behaviours. Now, the source of much controversy comes from the United States, where there was, between 2017 and 2019, a dramatic increase in youth vaping, using the measures that they use, which is use of an e-cigarette in the last 30 days amongst high school students. And that rose up to 27.5% of high school students, or 4.1 million young people, had used a vaping product in the last 30 days. But I think we need to unpack that before we understand what it's actually telling us. So we start from this bald figure: more than 1 in 5 young people are vaping, 27.5%. But let's break that down. Okay, how many of them were frequent users and how many infrequent users? We should really be less concerned about infrequent users because they're just, blowing vaping clouds at parties or whatever. It's not a compulsive behavior. It's not something that's, an addiction or a dependence. And you can see that more or less 2/3 of those were infrequent vapers. And I say we should be worried about them much less. Now let's do a different cut and look at who was already involved in tobacco or nicotine use. And again, around 2/3 of the young vapers were already engaged in tobacco use of some sort or another. And this is just adding vaping to that mix. And now let's look at both of those cuts together. And this is the story that we see. Hang on. We see that only a very small percentage, 1.4% of the 27.5%, are in this category of never having used tobacco before and being frequent users. But most of the frequent users were prior tobacco users. And for them, as I suggested with the UK, this may actually be a beneficial effect. It may be something that's diverting them from smoking. In fact, there's studies that I don't have time to present here that suggest that we are seeing a diversion effect of young people from smoking to vaping in the US youth population. Okay, and if that was the case, that would be a good thing. We also have to be clear about what's causing youth vaping. Here we see curiosity as the main reason, and rather than something like flavors. Yet a lot of the policy focus, as we'll see in a minute, is on flavors rather than the idea of curiosity. So a lot of the youth vaping in the United States is attributed to flavors, but it's not. It's a wider curiosity about vaping that is driving that. So this takes me on to the final areas, the pitfalls of making policy decisions based on a partial understanding of what is going on, particularly with youth vaping. Now, the Royal College of Physicians provided an excellent framework for thinking about policy, and I'll just put it up here. I'm not going to look into that because that's just too small to actually read, but that's the extract from their report. Let me break that down for you. What the Royal College of Physicians said is that if you take a risk-averse and precautionary approach to e-cigarettes, and that makes them, less easily accessible, less palatable or acceptable, more expensive, less consumer-friendly, pharmacologically less effective, i.e., a less satisfying nicotine experience, it inhibits innovation, then it may cause harm by perpetuating smoking. And this is a really deep insight, it's a really important insight because it gets to the fact that smoking and vaping are interrelated. And if you try to get tough with vaping, it may in effect end up as a regulatory protection for the cigarette trade and lead to more smoking and more ill health. So in the policy-making environment here, the primary concern is perverse consequences. So if you look at something like this warning, this product contains nicotine, which is a highly addictive substance. How does that actually play out with actual smokers? Now, ASH and YouGov surveyed smokers, and I'll just draw attention to the top line here. The main reason why smokers do not try e-cigarettes is that they do not want to substitute one addiction for another. So how does that work? How does that warning play out? Research was done on that. Excellent research by Sharon Cox and colleagues. Our findings suggest that the warning, the addiction warning, may reduce smokers' willingness to use and the likelihood of purchasing an e-cigarette. Perverse consequence from a warning that was put in place for good, well-intentioned reasons. Better warnings might look like this. What if we actually told people about the relative risks? What about flavors? Many American commentators say that kids are only vaping because of flavors. Why don't we ban flavors? Well, again, if we look at the pattern of use, we'll see that adults actually like flavors a great deal. So this is the picture of a breakdown of who's using what kind of flavors. And you can see that fruit, chocolate, dessert or pastry flavors are much, much more popular than tobacco and menthol flavors, the traditional flavors. Okay, so if you suddenly ban them, you might hope that the intended outcome would be abstinence from all nicotine. People give up vaping, they give up smoking, and they do something virtuous instead. But just look at this range of other things that people could do rather than take up smoking. I'm not going to go through them, but rather than quit vaping, they could start to smoke. They could use black market products. They could stay with smoking when they could have switched. They could relapse from vaping back to smoking. They could add their own flavors. They could do all kinds of things. So unless you think through the behavioral changes that you would get from a regulation, you're probably missing the point. Okay, this brings me to my almost last slides. We can't go through this, but maybe we can discuss it in conversation afterwards. The way to deal with this, essentially, is to draw a distinction between the combustible products that do the harm and the non-combustible products that are much safer alternatives to the harmful products and regulate them accordingly. So high taxes on cigarettes, low taxes on vaping. Ban the advertising of cigarettes, but control the themes of the advertising themes for vaping products and where and when you can advertise these products. So not that you give them a complete free ride, but that you control rather than prohibit. Prohibit smoking in public places, but allow it where the manager or owner of the premises wants to allow it. So that gives you a framework for thinking about policy. Have different policies according to risk. Okay, so those are my 6 main things that you need to know. I'm going to finish with a quick summary slide. Smoking remains a major problem, there's no doubt about that. It's still a massive public health burden, even if it is now less visible. Low-risk alternatives are available. There is good, strong evidence for reduced harm. It's a market-based and consumer-based solution, but there is good evidence that it's effective at displacing smoking and use in smoking and works in smoking cessation interventions. Got to keep the youth issue in perspective and recognise that young people engage in a range of risk behaviours. And then finally, there is a massive opportunity to exploit here, and we need to exploit the opportunity but manage the relatively trivial risks, in my view. Manage them, don't ignore them, but really exploit the opportunity. And I'm going to leave it there, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much.